Good evening. We're going to be reading the book Louis Sachar. We're going to read the first and second chapters. But before we do that, I have a couple questions. What do you think of when you hear the words Camp Green Lake? Why do you think they call it that? And what do they do there? Also, you're going to recognize a strange type of word in the main character's name, Stanley Yelnats. When you see it on the page, it'll look a little weird to you, and some of you may notice what kind of word that is, and some of you may not. We'll talk about it when we see it. Also, I have a small list of words that we're going to use as vocabulary words, and they're going to be uncommon to most of you. Some of you may have seen them before, but you may think, what does that word mean when you see it on the paper? When we get to words like wasteland, hammock, shriveled, forbidden, warden, and recovering, we'll try to use some of the context clues in the surrounding sentences to kind of pick apart and decode and figure out what each of those words mean. Let's get started. Chapter 1. You are entering Camp Green Lake. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it is just a dry, flat wasteland. There's that word. What do we think wasteland means? By the words that are surrounding it, that dry, flat. There used to be a lake there, but there's not anymore. We can infer that wasteland is something like a desert. That's what it makes me think of. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. Shriveled, what do we think that means? The next two words after and are dried up. So it's got to be something like what happens when something dries up, like a raisin shrivels. The wrinkliness that a raisin gets when it dries up, that's shriveled. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are two old oaks on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the two trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. That hammock, there's that word. A hammock is stretched between the two trees. Let's read on to find out. Maybe we can infer what that word means. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. All right. So the campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. Obviously, a hammock is something you lay in, and it's stretched between two trees, so it's obviously something stretched between two trees that you can lie in. Have any of you ever heard of a hammock? I'm sure you've seen them when you camp or things like that. A hammock is like a little net that connects to two pieces of trees that's big enough that stretches up and that you can lie in. And then that word forbidden. If the campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock because it doesn't belong to them, we could infer that that word means they're not allowed. Also, warden. Warden owns the shade. The warden seems kind of like she would be the boss. So warden is the boss of Camp Green Lake. Let's read on. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and in holes dug by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you. Usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day or two recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. There's that word, recovering. If he spends a day or two recovering in his tent after being bitten by a scorpion or a rattlesnake, We can use the context clues around that word to figure out that that word means he's resting and relaxing and healing from his wound. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always. If you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go into the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There is nothing anyone can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. You take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He had never been to camp before. All right, as we finished chapter 2, what do you think Stanley is going to Camp Green Lake for? It's a camp for bad boys, so he must have done something to get himself in trouble to end up at Camp Green Lake. Also, what do you think of now when you hear the words Camp Green Lake? Now that we know it's a wasteland and it's dry and barren and there's no shade there other than what the warden owns, what do we think? Why do we think the author used the words Camp Green Lake to describe such a place? Also, now that we know sort of a description of the lake, what are some other things that you can remember that we just read that kind of describes something that's not what it seems like Camp Green Lake is a dry lake bed?